Charlotte. And I know there are other people behind the scenes who had to work hard to help put this together. So thanks to all of you. And thanks for showing up to listen to my story. Today is the feast of the three archangels. I would like to say a prayer to get started. I think that's always a good start to any endeavor. And this is a prayer to Saint Raphael. O Raphael, lead us toward those we are waiting for, those who are waiting for us. Raphael, angel of happy meetings, lead us by the hand towards those we are looking for. May all our movements be guided by your light and transfigured with your joy. Angel, guide us by us. Lay the request we now address to you at the feet of him on whose unveiled face you are privileged to gaze. Lonely and tired, crushed by the separations and sorrows of life, we feel the need of calling on you and pleading for the protection of your wings, so that we may not be as strangers in the province of joy, all ignorant of the concerns of our country. Remember the weak, you who are strong, you whose home lies beyond the region of thunder, in a land that is always peaceful, always serene and bright with the resplendent glory of God. Amen. So just to give you a little introduction to myself, my name's Martha. I'm number 7 of 9 children, so Dorothy had quite a hassle of grandkids. And my parents, I was born in Staten Island, New York. My parents lived near the Cedar farm. I was born in 1955, and my parents moved to Vermont when I was 2 years old. And I have lived there ever since. My husband and I have built a house across the field from where I grew up. I have 30-year-old fruit trees that I planted. My roots go very deep there in Vermont. We raised 3 children. I'm a grandmother of 3 and a half children. And I grew up in the Catholic Church to a certain point. Dorothy converted to Catholicism along with the birth of my mother. It was a great inspiration for her. And my mother was raised Catholic. And I was raised Catholic, but my mother left the church when my father left the family, and I was outside of the church from my late teens until I turned 50. And that's a whole other story, what got me back into the Catholic Church. But I have recently been more involved with the Catholic Worker in New York, the Mother House, where Dorothy lived the last 5 years of her life and died there with my mother by her side. So my story is pretty simple. I'm not an academic. I firmly believe in keeping the story in one's heart and not just from the head. So I will certainly paint a picture for you of what my life has been like being involved in the Catholic Worker movement. As teenagers, we spent a lot of time at the Catholic Worker. We had a farm on the Hudson River north of New York, Tivoli Farm. It was a wonderful, idyllic place. And I pretty much grew up in community, what with having 8 siblings, but also spending time at the Catholic Worker. And when I was 14, my brother was drafted, and at the age of 20, he went to Vietnam and fought, killed. And that was a very pivotal moment for me in my life, to be standing in the kitchen and seeing my brother sent off to war. And while he was over there, we were on the streets of New York protesting war. So it was a very, very personal experience for me. As a child, I always heard about war. I always heard about famine, Biafra, the suffering that went on in the world. My mother was 7 years old when the Catholic worker movement started, and she was acutely aware of the suffering of the world. And that was very much translated to us children at a young age, this awareness. I grew up in poverty. My father left the family when I was 6 years old. Dorothy talks a lot about mother state, and it was a paradox. You know, she believed that it was personalism. We personally need to take responsibility for each other and to help each other out. And yet her grandchildren were raised with the assistance of the state and public assistance. So one thing that I've certainly learned very clearly in my life is this paradox, this tension of how to hold simultaneously apparently conflicting instances, situations, ideologies. And you know, that's the one thing that I really want to convey to you tonight is this question of tolerance, this question of understanding, you know, to be able to understand the position of the other and to not fear the other and to not condemn the other. And that's something that I was raised with my mother and grandmother. Very, very strong, clear message. So I've worked as an occupational therapist. I've trained as an occupational therapist and worked with school kids with learning disorders in the public school system. OT being a related service to special education. And my other area of specialty is in geriatric rehab, working with the elderly, rehabilitation. So I spent a good 20 to 30 years out of the Catholic worker movement, but still aware of the events with the worker, and very much aware of the political situation as it evolved from one war to the next throughout my lifetime. And so I raised a family, 3 kids, my husband and I, 3 kids between us. And then when I turned 50, I also had an experience of civil resistance work when I was quite young. I was 24 at the time. And in New Hampshire, they were building a nuclear power plant. And I protested the building of the Cedar nuclear power plant and was leafleting on the corporate headquarters of the outfit that was building this nuclear power plant. And we were given a 9-month sentence for leafleting. And so I had an experience of jail at quite a young age. And I came away from that experience. We ended up serving 3 months. There were 5 of us. We all happened to be Catholic, of Catholic background. And I ended up leaving that experience of prison with the thought, and this was while Dorothy was still alive. We called her Granny. I was 25 years old when she died in 1980. But I came away with the experience of, as long as we have prisons, we all need to experience them. And what I saw there was intense suffering and intense poverty and intense learning disabilities gone unaddressed. You know, socioeconomic, neurological issues that just were not addressed for these women. And so the prison population does consist of people who have less ability to cope with our system that demands quite a bit of attention. So I took a hiatus from all of that to raise my family. And then in 2005, there were a group of Catholic workers who took a trip to Cuba to visit Guantanamo Bay prison camp. And that certainly piqued my interest to hear that this group of 25 people were taking this pilgrimage. John Ashcroft announced the opening of Guantanamo Bay prison camp in 2002, and that pricked my ears up. I could not help but think, you know, who's going to be next to be sent to this prison? And so this group of people took this trip, and that's a whole other story in and of itself. And then that following year, in January of 2007, we took some actions down in Washington, D.C. Around this issue of Guantanamo mother-in-law. So that brought me back to the Catholic worker community in New York. I had attended my grandmother's funeral in 1980 and had not stepped foot into the community until 2004. And then I was very involved with it from 2007 onward. And so my first arrest after that hiatus was in 2007 at the district court in Washington, D.C. We were bringing petitions, habeas corpus petitions, to the courts in the names of some of the prisoners that were being detained at Guantanamo. So I came back into the Catholic worker community through the activism, the resistance work, but also it's very hard for me to explain what brought me back to the Catholic Church, but those stirrings started in 2004. And Dorothy took a retreat called the Father Huger Retreat. And as a child, I grew up hearing all about the Father Huger Retreats. And for my mother, it was, very difficult, very disastrous. And for Dorothy, it was a wonderful thing. So I had to find my place. I had to find my place between Dorothy's conversion and Gamar's leaving the church, my mother leaving the church, and also figuring out where I stood in my relationship to God and to the Catholic Church. So raising a family, getting involved with the resistance work, and then finally now I'm involved with the hospitality work of Mary House. And that's been just in the past year or so that I've been actually living at the house. I mean, I do have a husband back in Vermont, so I'm trying to split my time between both New York and Vermont. And just to give you some little stories about Dorothy, I'm often asked, what was it like to have a grandmother, that revered and that famous? And for us, she was just a regular grandmother. She was very good at keeping her life normal. She was a very, very humble person. She did not like all of the attention being brought to her or being placed on a pedestal. People would come to the house to see her and to talk with her, and she was quite upset. She would say, why don't you go downstairs and do some work, volunteer? This is what you should be coming here for, not me. This is not about me. It's about Jesus, and it's about the gospel and the works of mercy. So she was quite humble and quite warm as a grandmother. My very first memory of her is sitting in her house with my really good chat. She was a great storyteller. She was taking the time to come to Vermont as much as she could to be with her mother and her grandchildren. The work that she was doing was very hard, very demanding. And so I remember just sitting in her lap and being a very young child, 3 to 5 years old, and having this sensation of immense power and love coming from this person. And that's my earliest memories of her. While we were growing up as teenagers, it was not easy for her. The house was pretty wild. Raising 9 kids, we raised hell in many ways. She had to witness that and tolerate that. And my brothers were hunters. The local Vermont culture was about guns and hunting. So she had to see her grandsons handling guns. But she was so tolerant. She was always so tolerant and loving and not judgmental. When I was 14, we were staying at the Tivoli farm the summer of 1969, and Woodstock Festival was happening. And we kids really wanted to go. So I was the cutoff point. I was 14. My younger brother wanted to go. My mother said absolutely not. So I just barely squeaked through to get to go to this event. And Dorothy, in one of her journals, one of her journal entries, the 2 latest books that have come out, and I would highly recommend them to you, The Duty of Delight, her diaries, and All the Way to Heaven, her letters that most recently come out. But I've had to learn a lot about what she was thinking at the time because I was so young, and reading the journals has been a wonderful experience for me. And it's a tear-inducing, the joys